Hello, welcome back. So, today what I'll be sharing will be on the differences between thinking and feeling. So, I think intuitively people will understand what is thinking and what is feeling. It's just that sometimes what tends to blur the line is okay, if I am using this way of justification to make a decision, am I using feelings or am I using thinking? And somebody will potentially even ask like why is it so important to differentiate thinking and feeling? Then you can say that, well, for the most part, if we want to make the right decisions, most of the time we want to tend to use rationality, which is an aspect of thinking, instead of just instinctual emotional feeling, which could be based on animalistic drive. And you can say that most of the time, what our desires may not be in line with what is objectively going to generate the best value. But even in that sentence itself, I'm also attributing value in a way that is quantifiable. So again, if the thing that I'm saying right now seems confusing, don't worry. Hopefully at the end of this video, after I've gone through the differences of thinking and feeling, then the thing that I just mentioned is going to sound easier to a certain extent. But before I even get into it, you can say that the utility of learning, the difference between thinking and feeling, is one, to understand the human animal in more details. So, my understanding of personalities to a certain extent, which includes thinking and feeling, comes from the theory of Carl Jung. And for people who are not aware, the theory of Carl Jung is actually the foundation of a personality test called MBTI. That is when you get people saying that, oh, I'm ISFP, I am ENTP, or I am INFP. So, what does all these letters actually mean? I will eventually make a video on this, sharing in more details of the MBTI itself, although I myself is not an expert on it. But in general, you can say that what decides the personality type of the person comes down to the function theory of Carl Jung, which highlights 4 different functions: your sensory, intuition, and your thinking and feeling. So although there's 4 different categories of functions, to me, the one that will influence decision the most is still your thinking and feeling. So not to say that your sensory and your intuition doesn't come into play. They do come into play, but for the most part, even for my own personal use, when I try to profile people and try to interact with people based on their personality types, I will always focus on what is the type of thinking and feeling that they're utilizing. So the thing that I must highlight is that this video is only going to go through the differences between thinking and feeling. So I'm not going to go in depth of the function itself, but just more of how does thinking and feeling works in general. And progressively, the functions will come at a later video when I share more about personalities. But you can think of this as basically personality 101, because if you understand thinking and feeling, then you can say that the personality structure or the framework of MBTI just gets exponentially easier for you to understand. So let's get into the teaching itself, so to speak. So, thinking versus feeling. The way that I see it, thinking versus feeling, or rather the differences between both of them, can be observed and analyzed through three different differences. Yeah, that sort of makes sense. So one of which is how both of these functions actually get their data. So even before I go into this, by the way, if you want to understand how human beings make decisions, you can say that, like, going back to the first video that I shared on your mirroring and sense of importance, where I share about how human beings process information, right? You can say that our decision making process is also somewhat similar in the sense of we get a intuitive feeling or drive first, and we are unable to derive this. This thing is, to a certain extent, you can say that yes, it's kind of similar to emotion. To a certain extent, you can say that it's emotion, but just think of it as a sort of gut feel, right? And you can say that this feeling, in some sense, cannot be described in words at its initial stage, then what tends to happen is that this feeling is being passed into our dictionary, which based on our understanding of all the worlds, right? You can say that this is our abstract understanding of things, our concept understanding of things, and even things such as the dictionary definition of certain words, right? And it's only through this dictionary that we're able to translate the initial feeling into a string of words. And you can say that this is the point where these thoughts change from subconscious thoughts to conscious thoughts. And these thoughts itself, you can say that what we do with these thoughts is that we pass it through either our thinking or our feeling. And you can say that even after this step, after feeling, it might go into thinking, or after thinking, it might still go into feeling, until eventually we come to a conclusion, which comes down to decision. So you can say that the human decision making process works like this, right? We get a drive, you can say that it's a drive, you can say that it's a stimulus, and from the stimulus, we use our understanding of the world to translate into a string of words or a string of understanding, and then through there we utilize feelings and thinking to actually try to derive value from that thing, right? So understand is still quite abstract at this point, but trust me, it will eventually get easier and easier to understand. Now, the difference between thinking and feeling. Both thinking and feeling would derive data from different ways, so to speak. So difference number one is how they derive data. Derive data. And you can say that for thinking, in general, thinking, you can say that it's easy to understand, because to derive data for thinking, the data itself have to be empirical data, which means to say that data that can be proven. It can be scientifically, or mathematically proven, or it can be objective theories. So I think empirical data and scientific and mathematical proof is easy to understand to a certain extent, right? So the whole idea is that, okay, if I want to make a rational decision of whether or not I should buy A or I should buy B, then you can say that, well, probably what I want to know is data that is objective, right? How much is B going to cost? How much is A going to cost? And you can think of this as numbers to a certain extent, because the data of thinking tends to be quantifiable because they have to be objective, right? So one thing to also notice is the word objective in itself. Objective, to me, there's two different types of objective. One is that objective that can be proven. So for example, if let's say I were to say that 1 plus 1 equals to 2, right? You can say that you can prove 1 plus 1 equals to 2. Then, of course, outside of very complex mathematical calculations that could potentially give you 1 plus 1 not equals to 2, basically the idea is that there is a way to prove that 1 plus 1 equals to 2 based on mathematics, right? And even things such as quantifiable value and, let's say, probability and statistics, these are things that we can quantify, and when we utilize this is objective in nature. Whereas the other type of objectives is subjective thoughts, but held by a majority of the population. So what is some example of subjective thoughts? Right? Subjective thoughts more or less goes into the realm of preferences and opinions. So if let's say we take the thoughts of people in general do not find being overweight to be an attractive trait in their significant other. So that sentence alone, you can say that, well, they prefer their significant other not to be fat is subjective, right? Because that is a preference, that is whether or not we like somebody. But you can say that that thought is objective if majority of the general population have that same view. And you can say that, well, there are some people who's going to be like, I don't mind my significant other being fat. Even the sentence of I don't mind my significant other being fat implies that potentially it's a problem, because if it is not a problem, then that sentence doesn't need to be brought up. You do not need to not care about something if that thing truly doesn't matter. And in the situation that most people think in terms of overweight significant other, they'll always see it from a perspective of, even if they were to choose them, they did not choose them because of the trait of being overweight. It's likely that they have other traits, maybe such as humor, maybe such as they have resources, maybe even beauty and etc., that will offset that trait of being overweight. But the general idea, what I'm trying to get at, is that people in general do not want their significant other to be overweight. Of course, that is if they have a choice. Then you can say that being, in general, human being, that's the consensus of it. Although you can say that there's other theories that will support this, such as generally, if somebody is fitter, then they are much more likely to be reproductively healthy, and etc., and all the other things that will support this, right? But generally, you can say that this is an example where a subjective thoughts can be objective. But it's important to contrast this and actually evaluate whenever we think in terms of, well, if a lot of people have this view, does it necessarily mean that this is objective? Because you can say that if a echo chamber of a group of people were to hold a certain view, if that view is not a viewpoint of the general population in nature, or rather basically the viewpoint of the general population, right? Then you can say that that thought itself, although it's important to the group of people that have the thoughts, that thought is still subjective in nature, because it is not indicative of general population. And maybe you can say that one example of it is that the thought process of we should mandate respect for other people's pronouns. So the idea is that we should force people to actually use other people's pronoun, right? You can say that most people in general do not want to be forced to do anything. And of course, for people who feel like that affected them because they have their own special pronoun, then you can say that, well, those people, there's going to be a group of them that's going to view that this is something that have to be mandated, and because so many of us think this way, maybe that thought is objective. But even that thought itself is subjective in nature. So this is just deriving data for thinking, right? For feeling, data is derived from subjective. And what are some of these descriptors of subjective data? You can say that belief is one of it. Your belief, your faith, to a certain extent traditions, culture, and religion as well. So all of this falls under the category of feelings, because again, it's subjective, right? And the idea of whether or not the sun, how the sun actually works in medieval times, right? So you can think in terms of, if let's say right now we're in medieval times, and two person with limited scientific knowledge, they are trying to figure out what's this floating light orb in the sky is. Then you can say that, like, well, maybe you can say that there is a sun god, right? A sun god controls the sun, and he lifts it up in the morning and then like sets it down in the evening, and that's what explains the cycle. And you can say that, well, there's no empirical data to prove it, but that still becomes a foundation of their beliefs for some time, until of course empirical data comes and takes over. Then at some point I'm going to also discuss how human beings actually make decisions, right? So it's not even the case of even if empirical data starts to enter the data set, then people will actually choose empirical data over feelings. Because you can say that feelings in itself is subjective. And by nature of it being subjective, the value of the data can change. And that's one of the things that I'll share later on, which is how the two different functions, your thinking and feelings, actually derive data. But at this point, all you have to understand is that for feelings, your data is derived based on the idea of subjectivity, right? Like traditions, why should we have certain beliefs such as filial piety? So if let's say I have the discussion of, is filial piety important, right? Then you can say that, how do you actually prove that filial piety is important, right? Of course, you can trace back of the theories of reciprocation, right? If let's say somebody gives you something, then you can say that it's in our human nature to actually want to return the favor, right? But the general idea, just know that for thinking generally, the data is going to come from objectivity, whereas for feelings, the data is going to come from subjectivity. And I think this is a good time for me to actually share on the different parts of the brain, right? And I think that I've shared on this before, which is your foundation is always your reptilian brain. Your reptilian brain, followed by your animal brain. And you can say that your animal brain controls things such as your emotions and your instinctual drive. Right? Your reptilian brain also controls instinct, and it controls instincts to the extent of just three things, which is, can I mate with it? Can I mate with it? Can I eat it? Can it kill me? Right? So it's very rudimentary and it's very foundational, but the animal brain is what gives things such as emotion and feelings, right? And beyond our animalistic brain, then you can say that this is our rational brain. And one thing to take note of when it comes down to how thinking and feeling works is that feelings tend to work on the principle of the animal brain. Because feelings in nature tends to work on emotion, right? You are touching in terms of emotion, you are touching in terms of what do I like, what do I feel, how do I actually feel about it. Even the sentence of how do I actually feel about it is trying to derive subjective value about a situation. Because you don't have to quantify other things. All you basically have to ascribe is a certain value into the situation itself. Whereas your rational brain is the one where it controls the thinking. And because you can say that the rational brain tends to be conscious, whereas the animal brain tends to be subconscious, you can also see the terms of feelings and thinking to be controlled of more towards your subconscious or your conscious mind itself, right? Your thinking is going to be controlled more towards your conscious mind, whereas your feeling is going to control more towards it's going to be controlled more by your subconscious mind. Although this is by and large, there's always going to be some exceptions here and there, but this is just generally what it is, right? So this is difference number one between thinking and feeling, which is how they derive value. The difference number two is how they work. So if I were to go back to this, how they work. Now, thinking and feeling. For thinking works on the principle of equation, right? And the idea of, in order for me to make a decision that is rational, utilizing thinking, what tends to happen is that you can say that A, therefore B, right? This is the basic equation of thinking. And you can say that, yeah, to a certain extent, if let's say you want to rewrite this into summation, you can say that if A is the beginning, right? Let's say at the start, it's A. If I were to add action B, it will give me the results of C. And the idea of thinking is that thinking always works in terms of an equation. And because the data of thinking has to be empirical data, and it has to be scientific mathematics, you can say that the data that is inserted into the equation tends to be quantifiable. And in this equation, you can say that the outcome of it tends to be some form of numerical value, or at least things that make sense whenever we are using objective thoughts that by nature is still founded in subjectivity. But the whole idea is that if I were to give you one example of how thinking is being processed, you can say that if let's say I have a ball right now, and I take the action of throwing the ball will eventually reach point C. So which means to say that if I have ball plus action of throw, the outcome is going to be C. And another way to describe this is that you can describe this as cause and effect. So thinking basically works on the idea of cause and effect, right? And one of the way that you can also think in terms of feelings is because it's an equation and the data has to be quantifiable. One ways that rationality is being utilized is to use backwards deduction. So if I know that something plus something equals to the outcome that I have, if my observation right now is C, I can basically make inference of, okay, if this happens, then likelihood the foundation is A. So one of the examples that this can be utilized is when we are using personalities to actually understand people. So if I see in terms of, let's say we take body language, right? A certain action or a certain quote unquote signs is going to have multiple explanation. If somebody were to cross their arms, it could be that they are nervous or they are lying about the things that just came out from their mouth. So you can say that that's one of the ways that we derive it. C, if B action, which is if you are nervous, then A potentially could be, well, you are lying. So the equation is that, well, you are lying, and because you are lying, you cross your arm, and therefore I see that you cross your arm. So this is one of the ways that you can say that you can more or less try to use rationalities to actually figure out the truth of something. But again, you can also see that in this situation, if the action were to be changed, such as what if the person is cold, then you'll get another outcome of what A potentially is. So maybe it's not A right now. What is actually here is D. So maybe D plus E equals to F, for example. So what I'm trying to get at, well, it won't be equal to F, it will be equal to C because you start from C. What I'm trying to get at is that using the idea of rationality, you may potentially have multiple views. So when it comes to rationality, it's also the idea of juggling multiple views. And one of the ways to observe juggling multiple views is the idea of probability. So if an event have two possible outcomes and one is 80% and one is 20%, then you can say that, well, there's such things such as expected value where we more or less is able to derive the answer based on this potential equation. So this is how the thinking works, right? Whereas for feelings works on the idea of equivalence. So what's the difference, right? Thinking is about equation, or you can say equational, whereas feelings is about equivalence. The equation of feelings is generally A equals to B. Because you can say that, well, based on the data of feelings, subjective. So do you like blue? The answer can be yes, can be no. And if I were to ask 10 people, how much do you like blue? From 1 to 10, they are going to give me different answers. So because the data derived from feelings is subjective and the value can change. You can even say that to a certain extent our preferences would change over time, right? Just like if let's say right now I like to eat roti prata, maybe 10 years later I wouldn't like to eat roti prata for some reasons, right? It's something that can potentially change, and the only way that the equation can actually be formulated is if the idea of A equals to B. And of course, A equals to B, if let's say the easy way to understand thinking is from the sentence of cause and effect, what is a sentence that can help someone understand the idea of equivalence? The sentence is very simple, right? It's the sentence of it is what it is. Right? That basically sums up how feeling works. So if I were to ask you, if let's say we take the viewpoints of what is something that is opinionated in nature? What is something that's opinionated in nature? Let me just see. I actually do not have an example of something that is equivalence in nature. Okay, so maybe we just take the idea of, do you think? No, that is the thinking thing. Okay, let's say the idea of, we're going back to colors, right? Do you like the color red? Then you can say that what you potentially could say is, yes, I like the color red, or you can say, no, I don't like the color red. But based on your answer, if regardless of how you answer it, I were to ask you, why do you like the color red? Then you can say that it's very difficult for you to actually answer the question, right? Because fundamentally, the reason why you like red is because you like red. And you can say that this goes beyond just the colors itself. You can say that this even transcends to things such as human being. So, such as, if let's say I would ask, well, do you think that this person is attractive? Then usually what we tend to do is that we say yes or no, right? Most people don't have to actually consult their thinking function to figure out how they actually feel about somebody. They will be able to more or less judge, like, okay, do I like them, yes or no? So that is one example that you can say that would explain the idea of it is what it is. But there is also one thing that I have to highlight before I move on to the final point, is that the functions, although you can say that there is thinking and feeling, sometimes thinking can be utilized to actually justify feelings. So what do I mean by that? If we were to go back to the previous example that I cited, which is, if let's say you like somebody. So if I ask you, do you feel like this person is attractive? Right? Then you may potentially say that, like, yes, I find them attractive. Then if I were to ask the question, why? Then most people will probably, although how they decided whether or not this person is attractive is through the idea of equivalence, right? If I find them attractive, they are attractive. So A equals to B. But if I were to ask you to prove the how is A equals to B, then most people, what they tend to do is that they will actually utilize their thinking to actually justify a feeling. So what they'll tend to do is that they'll try to find reasons, right? What is a reason that I potentially could find this person attractive? Oh, maybe she is kind, maybe she is funny, maybe she has a nice sense of humor, maybe I just think that she's pretty, right? So you can say that this is one of the way, and by the way, this process is called rationalization, where what we tend to do is that we utilize thinking to actually explain a feeling. And the thing that you have to realize is that fundamentally, most of these instinctual decisions are at their root feelings in nature. And I'll even go as far to say that a mass majority of our opinions, and opinions by nature of the word opinion itself, falls under the category of feelings, is subjective. But when we ascribe thinking into it, it doesn't necessarily change it into a rational thought. It is just a reasonable way to explain a feeling. So what I'm trying to get at is that when we are using rationality, when we are rationalizing a certain thoughts, right? The danger that we fall into is that we think that that thought itself, or that viewpoint that we hold, is rational in nature, but in actual fact, it is actually subjective, or you can say that it's our opinion in nature, right? So it's actually not a rational thoughts. But is there a way where the opposite happens, where somebody utilizes feelings to explain thinking? Probably I'll have to think more about this. But the important thing that I have to highlight at this junction over here is that, and potentially I should have highlighted this a lot earlier, is that there is no such thing as a pure thinker, and there is no such thing as a pure feeler. Generally, for human being, is that we utilizes both thinking and feelings. And you can say that even for feelers, feelers in nature need to utilize thinking, and one of the examples that I explained is rationality, right? It's the idea of rationalizing a certain emotion, but thinkers in general will also utilize feelings, because going back to the idea of the three brains is that within all thinkers is still going to be their animalistic brain. The only difference between a thinker and a feeler is, in general, if they have to make decisions, what do they consult, right? A feeler is much more likely to touch their own feeling and then say that, okay, what do I actually feel about this? Maybe if I have to choose a red keychain and a blue keychain, I would choose the red keychain. Why? Because I like the red keychain. Whereas a thinker will be like, well, red is associated with this, so these are the benefits of red, and blue are associated with this, so this is the benefit of blue. So the data is that, A is this and B is this. And then you ask them again, well, so which one do you want? They'll still be unable to figure it out. So you can say that at this extent, there is limitations for both functions itself, right? There is no one objective good, one objective bad. Although people may say that, well, I would want to be more rational. The idea is that, do you actually want to be more rational, right? Because there's also a discussion of how we see thinking and feeling. And I think that in general, people would see rationality as to be better than feelings, because feelings is emotional drive. But the way that I see it is that they both have their utilities. And when we start to discount a certain function, then you can say that we make ourselves willfully blind to their influence, right? So if let's say a thinker would say that feelings in nature is not important, they would be influenced by feelings even if they are not consciously aware. To a certain extent, I'll even say that if you want to influence and you want to, use the stronger word, manipulate. If you want to manipulate somebody, it's easier for you to manipulate a thinker, because most of the time a thinker is not even aware of the emotional drive that control them. So if you can elicit a certain emotion in a thinker, the thinker would let the emotion actually pull them away and influence them without them being consciously aware. So by and large, I'll even say that although I'm not sharing about this right now, it's just more of a footnote, it's more of a detour at this point. In general, if you want to influence somebody, rationality is probably what you want to avoid using. There are some people that's going to make decisions based on rationality, but underlying all rationality, in my opinion, it's still feelings in nature. If we were to go back to the initial explanation of how it works, is that, remember, it's always a feeling first, followed by an explanation in words after your dictionary, then it goes into your thinking and feeling. So the whole idea is, foundationally for your thinking and feeling is always going to be your drive or a certain stimulus in nature, right? So of course I can't explain too much of this, because otherwise I won't have time to explain the last point. The last point of the differences between your thinking and feeling is how they ascribe values. So one of the funny thing, I'll explain the easier one first, right? Because thinking. Again, thinking is easy to understand how they derive value, because in general, you can say that the data and the equation of thinking is objective and quantifiable. Therefore, when you want to derive values from them, it's very easy, right? So if let's say I want to figure out the idea of how much is this thing worth, then you can say that, okay, if this thing is worth $2, and let's say I want to say, okay, how much does it actually cost to renovate my house, right? Or you can say the idea is this thing worth, then one of the way that I can potentially do it is that I can see objective data. So what are the material costs of this, right? The material cost of this, what is the manpower cost of this? And if I were to add the material plus the manpower, then what it will give me is the outcome of this is worth $4. So this is a very logical way to actually quantify the value of something, right? So let's say this is a keychain. And through, again, utilizing your thinking, we have figured out that, okay, because of the material, because of the manpower, then maybe I put in the idea of you want the person to earn a profit, right? Because no one does things for free. fair profit for the producer, then you can say that, okay, this is worth $5. Now, when it comes down to feelings again, because of the idea of A equals to B and the idea of it is what it is, you can say that using feelings to evaluate things is going to be, the value can be anything in nature. So again, going back to the idea of keychain, if let's say this keychain is a cute keychain of favorite character, and you can say that to a certain extent, celebrity merch or your anime figurines and everything works on the idea, right? You can calculate the material cost, you can calculate the design, you can calculate how much it actually does to manufacture the thing, but the whole idea is that this keychain can potentially sells for $50. And the idea is that people will still buy it. Why? Because of subjective values. Because they are utilizing feelings to ascribe values. And this thing also goes beyond just items in itself. You can say that using feelings, you can ascribe values to anything. So even the idea of, okay, if let's say somebody were to take certain action, the idea of going back to the first example that I used, someone have one up you at work, right? You said that like, oh, I closed one case, the person said that I closed two. You can say that one of the ways of thinking about it are like, oh wow, this person is an asshole, is utilizing feelings to ascribe the feeling. Is using feelings to ascribe the value of this conclusion, right? Because what you're saying is that A, or you can say this person, equals to asshole. Then even if someone would ask like, okay, why is this person equals to asshole? The truthful answer to it is because this person just is. There's no explanation. If you force me to give an explanation, then what I have to do is that I have to use some rationality to say that, well, maybe this person is not considerate, right? So considerate, right? Not considerate. So that is one of the reasons why this person is an asshole, right? But this also goes beyond just purely on something simple such as a keychain or a person. You can say that using the idea of ascribing value, you can also to a certain extent quantify things that by right can't be quantified. So such as the value of a person's life. So if I were to, this goes to the idea of, for activists, so if let's say somebody blocks the road, they block the road because they want to protest the utility of oil and petrol to a certain extent, and therefore they want to stop traffic because they want to get certain publicity, because the whole idea is that they are doing it to spread the idea of sustainability, right? So you can say that what they're doing is for a good cause. And again, who's to say that what they're doing is actually for a good cause, right? Why is it important to be sustainable? You can say that you can see it from the perspective of like logic, right? But if you can't quantify it, then guess what? Sustainability becomes a preference. But I think that subjectivity of sustainability is actually easier to objectify instead of things such as personal preference, right? Such as the example that I used in terms of a pronoun. But even if you use the example of these protesters, what they do, or activists, what they do is that they block the road, but in the event that somebody have died due to their action. So for example, if somebody fails to make it to a hospital either by car or by being ferried by ambulance due to the blockages of the road, then you can say that, well, these people would die. And the activists probably would see it from the perspective of, well, if few people have to die for the greater good of furthering sustainability, then it is fine, right? But that sentence alone, you can say that, well, people are going to have different views about it. Some people will say that it's not worth it. The life is always going to be more important. Then some people will say that, like, yeah, maybe like to a certain extent, this one person dying versus potentially if sustainability is being pushed forward, then we can potentially save tens and thousands of lives. So the whole idea of whether or not this balance out still comes back to ascribing value, right? So you can say that this person's life can be worth it if they gain sustainability. And which, by the way, if this sentence itself don't make sense to you, it's basically how feelings works, right? Because feelings is not supposed to make sense, because feelings cannot be quantified. It's the whole idea of working on the idea of equivalence. Life equals to be the loss of 2 lives, maybe, or 3 lives, is equals to the value that can be gained when it comes down to sustainability, right? So this is one of the differences when they ascribe values. And one of the things that I potentially have to highlight is also the funny thing about ascribing value is that as much as we use quantifiable data, valuation in itself is actually still influenced by subjectivity. What do I mean? I like to use the example of seeing it from the perspective of 2 people valuating houses. And you can say that financial valuation also works on the same idea, right? If let's say 2 persons were to evaluate a house, they might come to very similar answers, mainly because there are things that can be quantified. Distance from MRT station, convenience, and you can say that the property prices around the area, you can say that the view of the area, all this can be potentially summed up to an equivalent equation. But in order for you to actually derive value such as what is the worth of a scenery, you have to utilize the subjectivity, or you have to utilize feelings to actually ascribe the value, right? Because the value of a scenery is almost similar to the idea of, do you like blue or do you like red? And how much will you be willing to pay for blue instead of red? And the only way that you can answer that question is that if you inscribe certain subjective value into something that is objective value into something that is subjective in nature. That's basically what I want to say, right? That's basically my entire point. And you can say that this example alone of valuation could be an explanation of how feelings is being utilized by a thinker. So even if I want to be rational and I want to give the most fair and objective price about this property, I would still have to use some sort of subjectivity, right? Quantifiable distance, quantifiable convenience. So how convenient this place is, how do I measure convenience? Is it the distance towards the thing times a certain amount of money, right? That's not how people calculate convenience, right? We tend to put a certain value. We only know that the more convenient a property is, the higher the value. How much higher? It depends on fairness. Again, the whole idea of fairness is also a subset of feelings, right? Because what we deem to be fair is abstract, it cannot be quantifiable. All we need to know is that, well, things have to be equal to a certain extent. So the last point that I would share before I end off this is that when it comes down to valuation, there is a very funny and interesting thing about how feelings is able to derive value. And this is contrasted against how thinking works when it comes to valuation. You can say that the point of thinking is to get the highest number. And getting the highest number can be explained in the way of what is the best way for me to, what is the maximum value I can derive out of this action. So the point of using thinking to derive value is the whole idea of min-maxing. I want to maximize my value. The more that I gain, the better. So if let's say I were to do a work, if let's say I have to choose between 2 jobs and I take away all the subjectivity of it, how much do I like doing this, how much I like doing that, then it becomes the idea of what is the maximum dollar per hour of work. So if I have to work this amount of hours and the salary is this, I divide them together. I divide the number of the salary versus the number of hours that I have to work in total in a month. What is the amount of money I earn per hour, and I should choose the one with the highest value. So this is how the idea of thinking works, right? Because again, it's rationality. We want the thing that is logical. We want the bigger number. The interesting thing about how feeling works is that feelings works on the idea of, and feelings to a certain extent can derive value from losing value. So what do I mean by this? And I think one of the reasons why this is the case is because the value of the value when decided by feeling is subjective in nature, right? But one of the way to explain what I just said, which is feeling is able to derive positive value from actually losing value, is the idea of giving. So if let's say I were to buy a gift for you, I spend maybe $50 to buy a nice gift for you, and you get the gift, and let's say you get positive feelings. And even if you don't get the positive feelings, the fact that I spend hard-earned money to buy the gift for you as a gesture of love and affection for you give me the happy chemicals. So you can say that that is the gift of giving, right? But if you think in terms of that, in some sense, if we are seeing from the feeling perspective, me buying the gift for you and making you happy would make me happy and make it seem as though my $50 is worth. Because I don't think back to think that like, okay, wow, I regret spending the $50. Then if you regret spending the $50, guess what? It's not the idea that you are using thinking. Potentially what you are using is that you are using a mix of feelings and thinking to evaluate the gift, right? So my feelings for this person is not worth $50. If it's worth $30, then you can say that I can buy a $30 gift and be able to sleep like a baby at night. But the fact that my feelings is not worth $50, then it creates that sense of disconnect of like, okay, maybe I don't really feel that good about this. But what I'm trying to get at is, the funny thing about feeling is that feelings, by nature of them being able to derive value from losing value, can allow us to explain another aspect of human behavior, which is love. So I know that I'm detouring, but this is the final point before I close the video, right? Love is an aspect of feelings because love is subjective. If you have a love where somebody is trying to calculate the net value of why they choose you over another person, so for example, they say that, okay, your attractiveness is 7 out of 10, the other person is 6 out of 10, then your trait of kindness is worth 7 out of 10, and then because of that they sum up the total score and they choose you because your total score is higher than them, then you can say that if you found out that that's how they decided on pursuing you, you would feel a certain amount of being turned off by that because you feel like they don't really care about you, they don't really love you as a person. What does love actually mean? Love means the arbitrarily decided number that has to be high in nature, right? So I wish that the number that you inscribe on me or ascribe to me is a large number, regardless of who I am as a person, how shitty I am as a person, right? I hope that you'll still love me the same. That sentence alone means that I want you to ascribe a large number to me, regardless of objective data, right? What achievement I have, what the things that I know, what the thing that I have, the assets and everything, etc. And because of that, when it comes to love, if you want to prove your love, and that's the thing that I noticed, right? The day that I noticed this, it blew my mind, is that you can actually measure love based on sacrifice. And love is actually not measured based on quantifiable value because that would be a transaction. Love is actually measured based on how much you give. So in any case, this is my final point. So just to do a final summary of the things that I covered so far, is that I covered the difference between thinking and feeling. So remember, the thinking and feeling, the core differences between them is how they gather their data. The data of thinking in general tends to be more objective. The data of feelings is always going to be subjective. I don't think there's going to be a point where the data of feelings is going to be objective. And if the data that feelings have is subjective, or you can say if the data that feelings have is objective, through the equation at some point, because of the nature of the equivalence, you can say that objective data also doesn't matter, because through the equivalence is able to change into whatever it wants, right? So, but by and large, I would say that the core data of feelings is going to be subjective in nature. And the difference number 2 is that how they actually work. Thinking works on the idea of equation, right? Easy way to think about it is cause and effect. A plus B equals to C. Whereas Feelings works on the idea of equivalence. A equals to B. And it is what it is. Why is A equals to B? What do you mean why is A equals to B? A is just equals to B. Why should we have filial piety? What do you mean that we should ask the question, why should we have filial piety? We should just have filial piety because we want to be a decent person, right? What does it actually mean to be a decent people, right? And if you were to question the idea of why should we actually be decent human being, then what I'll say is that you are an asshole. Right, so you can say that all these sentences that I just said is all ascribing feelings, right? It's all ascribing values using feelings. So this is how feelings works. And finally, it's how we derive value. Thinking, the idea of thinking is that I want to get maximum value. I want to get the highest number possible. And the idea of valuation for feeling is that whatever I inscribe values on this is what it is. If I like this anime figurine, I will spend $500 on basically a designed pretty piece of plastic, but I'll be perfectly happy because of the emotion that I feel about this fictional character. And if you think that sentence doesn't make sense, guess what? That's what it's supposed to do. That sentence by right is not supposed to make sense. And because it doesn't make sense, that sentence in some sense makes sense to feelings. As silly as it sounds, right? And of course, the final thing about feelings is that feelings can derive value from actually losing quantifiable value. Funny as it sounds. But in any case, I know that I covered a lot about this, and I didn't expect covering these three aspects to be so long. I didn't expect this to actually go into 15 minutes. In any case, if there's any confusion on this, then do let me know where the confusion lies. This would be the foundation of personalities, and based on my sharing of this thinking and feelings, the next thing that I'll be sharing on this topic would be on the idea of how personalities actually work. So I'll actually touch on more towards the other functions, not just thinking and feelings. I'll go into more details of how the two different types of thinkings are the two different types of feelings, because again, although based on Carl Jung's theory, we have four different functions: intuition, sensory, thinking, and feeling. Both, or not both, all of the functions have introverted and extroverted versions. So you can say that in total, in actual fact, what we have is 8 different functions, and potentially what I'll share in the future when it comes down to me sharing in more details of the functions is I'm going to revisit the idea of thinking and feeling, and I'm going to explain what is introverted thinking, what is extroverted thinking, what is introverted feeling, what is extroverted feeling. Which, if you understand that, then you can say that it will help you a lot when it comes down to profiling somebody, to understand the personality and formulate the best strategy to actually interact with them. But in any case, this is where I'm going to end off. I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, if you have queries, do let me know. In any case, I'll see you on the next one. Bye.